Before I start, I, of course, want to thank several people. First of all, Eagle for an incredibly thoughtful and generous introduction and for coming out on your sabbatical to attend my talk and also show me around Vancouver today. I feel very lucky to have you as a colleague. I also want to thank the Graduate Student Association for inviting me. It's an incredible honor to have been chosen as somebody you'd like to hear from. This is a really fantastic tradition, and I'm really happy to have the chance to be a part of it. And I'm looking forward to getting the chance to meeting, hopefully, a lot of you over the next 2 days and talking to you about your work. I want to thank Tamara Calkins and Ken Corbett in particular, who have been emailing me over the last several weeks and managed to organize all this on relatively short notice since I came out pretty quickly after they'd invited me. So thanks for making it all so easy and bringing me here today. The talk I'm going to the material I'm going to be presenting tonight comes from my book that was just published on displaced children after World War II. But it's a talk that I wrote actually after the book had been published in an effort to kind of step back a bit and think a little bit more synthetically and broadly about how exactly ethnic cleansing and humanitarianism were linked through mobilization around children over the course of the 20th century. And these are questions that I'm still very much thinking about in my current work on migration, so I'll be really eager and grateful for any questions or feedback that you have. I'm going to start with 1948 and the United Nations Convention on the Protection and the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which had an unusual clause in it, one that's not received as much attention as some of its more famous precepts. That convention labeled forcibly transferring children of one group to another group, enacted with, quote, intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such as a form of genocide. In that same year, a right to a nationality was enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, along with the principle that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. Closer to the ground, Venita Lewis, who was a social worker working with the International Refugee Organization in occupied Germany, proclaimed, quote, the lost identity of individual children is the social problem of the day on the continent of Europe. Even if his future destiny lies in a country other than that of his origin, the displaced child is entitled to the basic human right of full knowledge of his background and origins. Children were, I think, at the symbolic heart of efforts to reconstruct Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. International humanitarian workers, government officials, and child welfare experts were particularly concerned about the fate of what they called lost children, hundreds of thousands of children who were separated from their families by bombs, forced labor, deportation, and murder. As the above quotation suggests, these lost children were endowed with a human right to a nationality after the Second World War. Repatriating and renationalizing displaced children, according to both humanitarian activists and government officials, was essential not only to the psychological rehabilitation of the children themselves, but also to the reconstruction of European civilization at large. But where did this strikingly nationalist conception of human rights come from? It seems kind of curious, the idea that children had a human right to a national identity. In this talk, I explore the history of international activism around...
I didn't get a chance to turn off my cell phone.
Uh-oh.
Thank you very much. I'm Eagle Glassheim. I teach Central European and Environmental History in the History Department. And it's really a pleasure to introduce Zahra from the University of Chicago. Also, I'm on sabbatical, so it's wonderful to have a chance to get out of my basement to come to campus and to hear a stimulating talk and some stimulating conversation. I noticed that the endowment, the Burge endowment, is actually named the Alice Maud Burge Endowment. And the endowment, in the description of it, it says it was established by UBC alumnus Bill Burge in honor of his mother, who shared his love for history. And I thought that was really quite fitting, in particular for today's speaker. She's a distinguished historian of childhood and education, among other things, in 20th century Europe. Tara Zahra's first book, published in 2008, is already a classic in my own field of Central European history. Its title is Kidnapped Souls, National Indifference and the Battle for Children in the Bohemian Lands, 1900 to 1948. It's a book that has won several awards, and it's filled with fascinating stuff for historians of nationalism, of education, and of the welfare state. She shows in this book how Czech and German nationalist activists used education not only to win converts to their respective national communities, but also to convince the nationally indifferent that nationalism was good for them, in both a material and a moral sense. And I've actually assigned chapters of her book in my East Central Europe course, and I can attest that it's an excellent teaching book, and so I thank her for that. Above all, it gives students a concrete sense, literally a bricks and mortar sense involving schools anyway, of how nationalist identities are constructed. And it also upends assumptions that national belonging is something natural or inevitable. My students, in fact, were surprised to learn that nationalism is really hard work. And that's, I think, something that's wonderful about this book. It shows just how hard nationalists work to advance their agendas and nationalize their respective populations. Though Kidnapped Souls is deeply rooted in this very particular context of bilingual Bohemia, in the Habsburg monarchy and then in Czechoslovakia, the book's filled with insights and historiographical engagements that transcend that context. And I think that's what made it such a powerful and now influential book that goes beyond simply our field of Central European or Czechoslovak Central European history. And that points to Tara's most recent book, titled The Lost Children, Reconstructing Europe's Families After World War II. And this book is hot off the presses, or at least by academic standards. It came out in this past May. My copy arrived in the mail yesterday, so I'm still basking in the excitement of a new book by a favorite colleague. And I've read a bit of it in my spare moments here and there. On the surface, this is a book about orphaned and displaced European children after the war, spanning a continental and ideological spectrum that ranged from Poland to occupied Germany to France and other countries in between. But the book's reach and ambitions are much wider than this. It also sees children as a mirror and a preoccupation for several constituencies. These include American occupation authorities and social workers in Europe. For post-war Czech and Polish nationalists who were at the same time trying to create ethnically homogeneous states, but also demographically robust states. That is, they didn't want to lose any more population than they had to, even as they were ethnically cleansing German minorities in their state. And then also, children are a mirror and a preoccupation for Zionists and their allies trying to build a Jewish state in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So in one sense, in this book, children are pawns, or even, as Tara memorably puts it in her introduction, a form of wartime plunder. But as in her first book, as in Kidnapped Souls, children here also have a voice. Edith Milton, a German Jewish refugee, wrote of her fractured childhood, and this is quoted in Tara's book, "The weather of despair always hangs at the edge of my memory of my first 2 years in America. It threatens to cover the world of refugees among whom I now live." And when I read that, I was moved, and perhaps felt that I better understood the pain of dislocation. She was also separated from her family. So Tara's narrative vividly captures that pain of dislocation, but even more than that, it historicizes it. And she leads her readers to ask why Edith Milton and so many others came to see or understood their childhood experiences of dislocation in traumatic ways or in terms of trauma. And this also then got me wondering why I was so moved by Edith Milton's account of her experiences. And I think really this is an example of the best kind of history that helps us to historicize our own ways of seeing. Tara's talk this evening is titled "Saving the Children, Humanitarianism and Displaced Children in 20th Century Europe." Please join me in welcoming her.
Before I start, I, of course, want to thank several people. First of all, Eagle, for an incredibly thoughtful and generous introduction and for coming out on your sabbatical to attend my talk and also show me around Vancouver today. I feel very lucky to have you as a colleague. I also want to thank the Graduate Student Association for inviting me. It's an incredible honor to have been chosen as somebody you'd like to hear from. This is a really fantastic tradition, and I'm really happy to have the chance to be a part of it. And I'm looking forward to getting the chance to meeting, hopefully, a lot of you over the next 2 days and talking to you about your work. I want to thank Tamara Calkins and Ken Corbett in particular, who have been emailing me over the last several weeks and managed to organize all this on relatively short notice since I came out pretty quickly after they'd invited me. So thanks for making it all so easy and bringing me here today. The talk I'm going to the material I'm going to be presenting tonight comes from my book that was just published on displaced children after World War II. But it's a talk that I wrote actually after the book had been published in an effort to kind of step back a bit and think a little bit more synthetically and broadly about how exactly ethnic cleansing and humanitarianism were linked through mobilization around children over the course of the 20th century. And these are questions that I'm still very much thinking about in my current work on migration, so I'll be really eager and grateful for any questions or feedback that you have. I'm going to start with 1948 and the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which had an unusual clause in it, one that's not received as much attention as some of its more famous precepts. That convention labeled forcibly transferring children of one group to another group, enacted with, quote, intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such as a form of genocide. In that same year, a right to a nationality was enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, along with the principle that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. Closer to the ground, Vanita Lewis, who was a social worker working with the International Refugee Organization in occupied Germany, proclaimed, quote, "The lost identity of individual children is the social problem of the day on the continent of Europe. Even if his future destiny lies in a country other than that of his origin, the displaced child is entitled to the basic human right of full knowledge of his background and origins. Children were, I think, at the symbolic heart of efforts to reconstruct Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. International humanitarian workers, government officials, and child welfare experts were particularly concerned about the fate of what they called lost children, hundreds of thousands of children who were separated from their families by bombs, forced labor, deportation, and murder. As the above quotation suggests, these lost children were endowed with a human right to a nationality after the Second World War. Repatriating and renationalizing displaced children, according to both humanitarian activists and government officials, was essential not only to the psychological rehabilitation of the children themselves, but also to the reconstruction of European civilization at large. But where did this strikingly nationalist conception of human rights come from? It seems kind of curious, the idea that children had a human right to a national identity. In this talk, I explore the history of international activism around most of the girls and women had been bribed to deny their origins by gifts of clothing, personal adornments such as beads, cheap jewelry, etc., whereas the boys had been compelled to submit by force. She conceded that many of the Armenian women and children actually ran away and returned to their Turkish families after they'd been rescued by the League. But she insisted that these runaways suffered from a, quote, distorted mentality and blamed surreptitious visits or communication from the Turkish family who either brought or sent some tidbits of food or presents of some kind. The League of Nations also established neutral houses for Armenian women and children. In the neutral houses and affiliated schools in Aleppo, the Commission explicitly aimed to renationalize, re-Christianize, and, quote, re-civilize lost Armenians. One Commission member reported in August of 1924, quote, "It is hard to believe your eyes when you compare the people in rags, dirty and of a savage bearing who arrive here with the more or less civilized people who leave us months later. At first, our protégés often try to run away if life here doesn't completely suit them. But soon the Armenian within begins to reappear. Before they leave us, they are completely returned to their nationality." The League of Nations ended its work in Constantinople in 1926 and in Aleppo in 1927, partly strangely due to, not so strangely, due to protests from the French government. At that point, these territories were under French mandate, and it was considered an infringement on the sovereignty of the French. Some 4,000 children and 4,000 adults ultimately received aid from the Commission. And these were pretty modest figures. But the striking continuities between the efforts of the League and post-World War II efforts to reclaim East European and Jewish children suggests to me the extent to which interwar conceptions of collective rights were absorbed into the post-war visions of human rights that emerged after the end of the Second World War. The League's mission in the Near East also underscores the centrality of the transfer of children to 20th century experiences of war, displacement, genocide, and reconstruction more broadly. It reveals the ways in which victimized children in particular justified new forms of humanitarian intervention and the extent to which that intervention could in fact serve nationalist goals. After the Second World War, international organizations and European policymakers organized the search for lost children on a much larger scale. Among Jewish organizations in particular, the recovery of hidden children from Christian families and institutions was immediately linked to the memory of the dead and to the regeneration of the Jewish community. As in Armenia, however, the problem was that the guardians of hidden Jewish children were often reluctant to relinquish their wards. In Poland, the Education Department of the Central Committee of Jews in Poland reported bitterly that many Poles would only return Jewish children for a considerable price. The ransoms demanded by Polish foster parents were actually inflated by a bidding war that erupted on the ground between competing Jewish organizations, Zionist and non-Zionist organizations. Custody disputes were also particularly numerous in France, where up to 10,000 Jewish children were saved from the Nazis in hiding. The most famous of these cases was the Finley affair, which inflamed long-standing tensions between Catholic and secular camps in France and dominated the headlines for several months in 1953 and was occasionally referred to as a second Dreyfus affair. In that case, Antoinette Brun, the Catholic foster mother of 2 hidden Jewish boys, defied the orders of French courts to return the boys to their surviving relatives. She instead secretly baptized them and then ferried them over the Pyrenees to hide them in Spanish monasteries with the protection of Franco's regime, of course. With time, it became evident that the actual number of surviving Jewish children was tragically small. But this actually only amplified the stakes. In an appeal to the Vatican in March of 1946, Rabbi Isaac Herzog, who was then the chief rabbi of Palestine, explained, quote, "As of today, every child signifies for us 1,000 children." The loss and recovery of children was clearly central to 20th century experiences of genocide. And yet I think it would be misleading to see denationalization as a step on a slippery slope to extermination. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew who authored the 1948 Genocide Convention, famously insisted that the cultural assimilation of a minority group represented what he called a form of cultural genocide. In reality, however, Nazi racial planners sought to Germanize only those children that they believed could become German through assimilation. It was precisely those minority groups deemed biologically incapable of assimilation who were targeted for annihilation. A perceived link between denationalization and biological deconstruction nonetheless resonated widely after the war. East European officials, in particular, deliberately conflated denationalization and genocide as they sought to place themselves at the top of an imagined hierarchy of victims and to equate themselves explicitly with Jewish victims of Nazism. A 1948 Polish memo to the International Refugee Organization asserted, quote, "In violating all of the laws of humanity and stomping on human rights, the Germans organized in a systematic fashion unique to themselves the kidnapping of children in pursuit of a double goal, the biological reinforcement of their own nation and the biological destruction of the defeated population, who, according to their plans, were condemned to complete extermination." In some respects, as Mark Mazauer has argued, Raphael Lemkin's vision of cultural genocide reflected the last gap of an old order. His goal was really to resuscitate the Interwar League of Nations with stronger enforcements of minority protections, of minority rights protections. The great powers saw the interwar regime of minority protection as a destabilizing force and opposed any effort to transpose minority rights into the new international order after the Second World War. So the Genocide Convention was only ratified once the criminalization of cultural genocide was struck from the text. Significantly, however, many East European delegates supported the concept of cultural genocide. A Czech representative to the United Nations specifically invoked Hitler's, quote, "gigantic plan for the complete Germanification of the Czech population" in a speech in support of the clause. And if we examine the practices of United Nations workers in the field, as well as the rhetoric of both Jewish and East European policymakers after the war, it's clear that aspects of Lemkin's vision, itself a product of an East European culture of collective rights, did survive in post-war Europe and were integrated into post-war understandings of human rights and of humanitarianism. Private Jewish agencies led efforts to reclaim children from Christian hands after the Holocaust. But the search for lost children was also taken up by the United Nations itself alongside East European governments. The major responsible agencies were the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which I'll refer to as UNRWA, and its successor, the International Refugee Organization, or the IRO. UNRWA and the IRO took up the search for East European children in the British and American zones of occupied Germany and Austria. UN child search teams were organized to basically scour the countryside with the goal of reclaiming, renationalizing, and repatriating lost East European children. And they did this in the name of democratization, justice, and human rights, as well as in the psychological best interests of children, or in what they viewed as the psychological best interests of children. And here it might be useful to give you a little bit of background on how children, East European children in particular, got lost in the first place. When the Nazis overran Eastern Europe during the Second World War, they had in fact attempted to enrich their demographic power through the Germanization of Slavic children who were deemed to possess German blood. The Nazi regime's use of the term re-Germanization to describe this scavenger hunt for German blood had deep historical roots. During and after the Second World War, Nazi officials justified Germanization policies as a form of restitution for alleged losses to the German population through interwar Czechification, Polonization, Slovenization, and so on in East Central Europe. Actual efforts to forcibly Germanize children in Eastern Europe met with a fair amount of resistance and spotty success. But after the war, East Europeans remembered the Germanization of children as one of the Nazi regime's greatest crimes. Stories of children that had been stolen or kidnapped from Eastern Europe circulated widely in the press and in humanitarian publicity and film. East European officials also wildly exaggerated the number of children kidnapped by the Nazis. So the Polish government declared that at least 200,000 Polish children had fallen victim to Germanization during the Second World War, whereas historians have more credibly estimated that around 20,000 children might have been kidnapped from Poland, up to 50,000 from all of Europe. But precise numbers are really hard to come by as they depend on the definition of Germanization in a context in which national loyalties were often ambiguous. Many East European parents voluntarily applied for German citizenship and so thereby Germanized their own children. Others were abandoned. Other people abandoned their children in German families and institutions while working as forced laborers or living in DP camps after the war. In any event, East European officials in the 1940s would not have distinguished between a child that had been kidnapped from his or her parents, an abandoned Slavic child placed with a German family for adoption, or a child Germanized by his or her own parents. According to the logic of the time, children could be kidnapped not only from their parents, but also from the national collective. United Nations social workers claimed, at least officially, to stand above these kinds of nationalist concerns. In an expression of their individualist ethic, they pledged to uphold the best interests of the child as the guiding principle of child welfare. And the whole best interest principle, based on the casework method, where you examine each individual case, was intended to repudiate Nazi racial hierarchies. Focusing on the best interests of individual children implied the rejection of other possible criteria for making child welfare policies, like the goal of creating a master race, or of creating model socialist citizens. But the meaning of these best interests was, of course, not transparent. Based on the belief that children's psychological rehabilitation depended on the cultivation of a firm national identity, UNRWA and IRO social workers, as well as East European governments, came to define the individual best interests of displaced children in distinctly nationalist terms. I think several factors explain this focus on renationalizing lost children among UN social workers. First of all, it was pragmatic. Access to basic necessities like food, housing, resettlement, and of course, citizenship rights all depended on nationality. A central job of United Nations workers on the ground was to classify refugees into different groups, each of which essentially enjoyed access to a different set of rights. UNRWA and the IRO also organized DP camps along national lines in order to facilitate repatriation and avoid national conflicts. But the nationalization of refugees was more than just a necessary evil or a pragmatic gesture in the eyes of relief workers. As we've seen, it continued the logic of humanitarian intervention established by the League of Nations after the First World War, when the League Commission in the Near East linked the renationalization of Armenian children to universal humanitarian values. Western relief workers, I think, also learned something on the ground in Eastern Europe. Initially, many UN workers, who were mostly American and British social workers, were troubled by the nationalist organization of relief work. But many gradually changed their minds in the field. In the words of UNRWA child welfare worker Susan Pettis, quote, "At first I couldn't understand why the Army and UNRWA almost immediately set up different camps for Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, West Europeans, etc. Imbued with the idealistic sense of one world, I felt disillusioned when that unity didn't materialize right away. I soon realized, however, that for both psychological and practical reasons, national grouping was best during the insecure and traumatic times in the lives of the displaced. Emerging ideals of human rights, relief, and democracy in post-war Europe were not simply imposed from above by Allied occupation authorities and humanitarian organizations. They were also informed by long-standing pedagogical and political practices on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe. In the case of Jewish refugee children in particular, many humanitarian workers gradually became convinced of the merits of Zionist solutions. Beginning in 1946, in the aftermath of the Kielce pogrom in Poland, some 200,000 East European Jews began to flee from Eastern Europe into the American zone of Germany, hoping to move on to Palestine. Many children and youth came in kibbutzim, even though they still had living parents alive, living parents or relatives that were still in Eastern Europe. American and British social workers were initially skeptical about the separation of Jewish youth from their families. Conflicts over the relative merits of Zionist education and familial care for Jewish children erupted in a heated debate at a 1947 meeting of UNRWA's Jewish Child Care Committee. One representative of the American Joint Distribution Committee claimed that kibbutzim were actually preferable to family life. Quote, "The group leaders are much better for the children than a disturbed mother and father in a DP camp." UN social workers were initially fairly unsympathetic to this view. In one 1948 memo, an IRO child welfare officer concluded in frustration, "In view of the utter disparity between IRO's commitments toward unaccompanied children and the accepted Jewish principle whereby an orphan belongs to the community, it is obvious that as regards unaccompanied children, our aims will always be completely at variance." But in spite of such initial reservations, many UN workers gradually embraced the Zionist solution. Social workers were persuaded by encounters with Jewish youth who themselves had passionately set their sights on Palestine. UNRWA workers also came to support the education of youth in kibbutzim for pragmatic reasons. Relocating Jewish youth to kibbutzim and training farms freed up space in overcrowded DP camps. And they seemed to serve a rehabilitative function at a time when surviving Jewish youth were seen as morally and psychologically debilitated. Jack Whiting, UNRWA's zone director, expressed his support for the creation of Zionist training farms in March 1946. Farm labor, he maintained, represented a valuable antidote to a perceived epidemic of, quote, petty thieving, black marketeering, and loose morals among DP youth. And that was a very common view of displaced persons and displaced children in particular after the war. UNRWA and IRO workers were even more passionate in their determination to renationalize East European children. A central mission of UNRWA's child search teams was to comb the German countryside in search of Germanized children. Simply identifying these children required tremendous detective work. Many young children, of course, had no memory of all of their native language or their families. In 1947, Jean Henshaw described Polish and Yugoslav children who had, quote, renounced their country, language, and culture and vehemently claimed they were Germans. Once identified, UN child search officers sought to remove what they called allied children from German families as quickly as possible. These children sometimes had to be removed from their German foster parents by force. Custody battles over displaced children generated sharp tensions between the United Nations, Allied military authorities, East European governments, German foster parents, and DPs themselves. In the name of the best interests of the children, British and American military authorities often preferred to leave lost children in German homes. They insisted that children would be emotionally scarred by removal from their foster parents. And increasingly, Allied military authorities also objected the repatriation of East European children for political reasons because they didn't want to return children behind the Iron Curtain. UNRWA and IRO child welfare officers, however, consistently favored removing children from German homes and repatriating them to Eastern Europe, even once the communists had consolidated their power in Eastern Europe. In 1948, Eileen Davidson, then deputy chief of the IRO's Child Search Section, argued that this policy represented the best interests of the child from a psychological, moral, and political perspective. Her argument rested on the conviction that German society had not been purged of Nazi racism. So the possibility of true integration for East European children in post-war Germany, in her view, was slim. East European children left in Germany, she concluded, would suffer permanent psychological damage even if they were loved and well cared for. Quote, "Far from securing the best interests of the child, one has to run the danger with the passage of years of contributing to the development of a warped and twisted personality, a misfit with roots neither here nor in his home country." Davidson's position was typical of UN social workers, and it reflects their use of developmental psychology to square the circle between individualist ideals and nationalist policies, as they basically defined individual children's psychological needs in nationalist terms. In practice, this meant that UNRWA and the IRO generally respected the demands made by East European governments for the repatriation of children, even if those children were orphans who didn't have family in Eastern Europe. Officially, only representatives of an orphan's country of origins were entitled to approve decisions about a child's adoption, resettlement, or repatriation. In addition, unaccompanied East European children could not be adopted by foster parents of a different nationality, which was in accordance with domestic laws in Poland, Yugoslavia, the USSR, and Czechoslovakia. The UN didn't simply respect these national rights to children out of deference to East European nationalists. In a 1948 memo, one IRO official elaborated, quote, "Every child's future is too important to be decided by a representative of a foreign nation. There can be no doubt that in order for things to run smoothly, the guardian must be of the same nationality as the child. If such a line is followed, nobody will be able to reproach the IRO for its desire to assimilate denationalized children or to develop cosmopolitans." These views also shaped the pedagogical practices that developed within refugee camps and children's homes, of which there were hundreds in occupied Germany and Austria after World War II. In the International Children's Village in Trogen, Switzerland, for example, 132 orphans were housed in 8 distinctive national homes, each appropriately decorated and furnished in national style. A teacher in the village boasted, quote, "It is really amazing to observe with what toughness and vitality even the smallest group preserves its national character if soundly organized. In each of these small colonies, the very best elements of national culture comes to the fore." The cultivation of each child's national identity was essential to his or her psychological well-being, concluded Therese Bross, who was a writer for UNESCO. In the course of our visits to the children's communities, we saw indeed how much the children need a country of their own if they are to be psychologically normal. The all-important requirement for children who have been moved from one country to another is to settle the child and provide him with a country of his own and a language and culture, which that implies. These efforts to recover East European and Jewish children after World War II suggest some striking continuities in ideas about humanitarian relief and human rights across the 2 world wars. Lost children were in fact both victims and beneficiaries of the drive to create nationally homogeneous states in Europe. On the one hand, the perceived ability of children to learn new languages, new religions, and adopt new identities saved many of their lives during both the Armenian Genocide and World War II. But this ability to assimilate was a double-edged sword. In a war of warring nationalist movements and population politics, in a world in which having a larger population was seen as a measure of political and economic military power, it also transformed children into a form of wartime plunder that could be captured and remodeled by nations that were looking to expand their ranks. Ethnic cleansing and humanitarianism were also deeply entangled in migration and asylum policies from the 1930s onward. The fundamental goal of these policies in both Eastern and Western Europe was to engineer homogeneous nation states. That meant that children seen as particularly malleable and assimilable were generally privileged. This logic was at the heart of the Kindertransports from Nazi Germany and Austria in 1938 and 1939. In the context of the Great Depression, the admission of Jewish children was far more palatable to British authorities than the admission, and the British public, than the admission of their parents, who were considered culturally and economically undesirable. And so 18,000 children escaped the grip of the Nazi regime while their older siblings and parents were left to their fate. And the United States, of course, had an even worse record. After 1945, hierarchies of race and age were intertwined in European migration and asylum policies. In the face of persistent labor shortages, governments around the world began to see the refugees that were crowding German and Italian DP camps as a potential demographic and economic resource. But they evaluated the desirability of refugees in nationalist, racial, and age-specific terms. The resettlement of displaced persons became a forum for defining post-fascist migration and citizenship policies, and for debating the possibilities and limits of assimilation. So, for example, many Jewish refugees, thousands of Jewish refugees, crowded Europe's DP camps in 1945. But Jewish adults were still not considered among the refugees that were viewed as desirable in the scramble for good migrants. An immediate priority of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Interior Ministry after the French liberation was to deport German Jewish refugees who remained on French soil. A government memo written in early October 1945 specified, quote, "It is desirable that the French government should, at the opportune moment, ask these refugees who are of no economic or demographic value to leave our country." Georges Maucou, who is the leading French population expert at the time, argued that the very status of Jews as victims made them undesirable immigrants. He insisted that they were psychically and sometimes physically diminished by their despair or by persecution. But at the very same time, Jewish children who had survived the Holocaust were welcome in France in widely celebrated ceremonies and rehabilitation programs because they were seen as malleable and as capable of becoming French through education, as were, ironically, children born to German mothers and French soldiers in occupied Germany after the war. In Czechoslovakia, meanwhile, surviving German-speaking Jews were actually deported along with other Germans after World War II. In May of 1945, the Czechoslovak Ministry of the Interior sent a memo to the Jewish community in Prague specifying that any Jew who had registered as a German on the 1930 census would not be considered a Czechoslovak citizen and would be subject to deportation. But here, too, age could make a difference. Czechoslovak officials thus ruled that exiled Czechoslovak citizens over the age of 14 could be repatriated from Germany only if they had mastered the Czech or Slovak language, and that included Jews. Orphans over the age of 8 were subject to an investigation to determine their nationality based on objective characteristics. Orphans under the age of 8, however, could be repatriated even if they were classified as Germans, Jews, or Hungarians, once again because Czech officials assumed that they could be easily re-educated and assimilated as Czechs. These policies reflected a general focus on selecting individuals deemed desirable or assimilable from among the masses of refugees in post-war Europe. In the words of Francis Perrin of France's new National Demography Institute, quote, "There are currently masses of available candidates for immigration in the world. Now is the moment to choose those who will be the most easily assimilable. In 2 years, it will be too late." In both the East and the West, Europeans emerged from the war convinced that only national homogeneity could prevent the outbreak of World War III. This conviction shaped both the immigration policies that developed in the West after the war, as well as the wave of ethnic cleansing in the East. It also informed immigration and asylum policies outside of Europe. So Australian authorities, for example, dreamt of populating their country with British orphans and war babies after the war. But non-white children, along with any child with a physical or mental handicap, was officially excluded. In the United States, the 1948 and 1950 DP Acts enabled over 400,000 refugees to enter the United States with special provisions for children. But this humanitarian legislation specified that 30% of new Americans had to be agricultural workers and 40% had to come from territories annexed by the USSR, and very few Jews, of course, were agricultural workers. Baltic refugees enjoyed most favorite refugee status. While visiting Germany, Congressman Frank Shelf of Kentucky praised Balts as they had, quote, every sign of having come from good stock and good breeding. The DP Acts of 1948 and 1950 did ultimately permit around 100,000 Jewish DPs to enter the U.S. in spite of these restrictions, partly because aid workers interpreted the requirements liberally. But the U.S. certainly joined other countries of emigration with policies of selective humanitarianism. Across Europe, policymakers transformed the post-war refugee crisis into an opportunity to remake their populations. And across Europe, children were basically seen as the most desirable migrants of all by virtue of their perceived capacity for assimilation. The rise of international adoption after World War II, and international adoption actually is one legacy of the Second World War, reflected these hierarchies. Orphans were basically seen as the greatest prize of all. They were assimilable children unattached to undesirable parents. A preoccupation with recruiting assimilable migrants in order to create homogeneous nation-states transcended an East-West divide after World War II, shaping both East European policies of ethnic cleansing as well as West European and American migration policies. And it cut across what was, at the same time, a really widespread rhetorical emphasis on family reunification. I would argue that the histories of humanitarianism and of ethnic cleansing in 20th century Europe are not unrelated or contradictory. By privileging the young and assimilable, European policymakers sought to craft nationally homogeneous populations under the cloak of humanitarian rhetoric. International humanitarian organizations were complicit with these goals as they pursued the repatriation and renationalization of children in the name of human rights and children's best interests. From the Armenian genocide to the kinder transports to the post-war resettlement of European refugees, children were not only saved to the extent that they were saved from war, racial persecution, and purgatory in refugee camps because they were seen as particularly innocent or vulnerable. Children were saved because they represented the biological future of nations. And they were saved to the extent that people believed that they would assimilate and serve the dream of policymakers to construct homogeneous nation states. Thanks. I have been told that I should, that we have some time for questions and that I should field my own questions. So I'm happy to answer questions. Whoops. Yes.
So it was mentioned that you discussed the agency and voices of children in the book, and I was wondering if you would share, some of that with us.
Sure. Yeah, it doesn't come up at all in this talk. I think one of the things that I found most interesting in doing this research was the way in which children themselves often had very strong ideas about where they wanted to be in the process of all of these custody battles that emerged over their fate. And I guess it's probably not incredibly surprising that children often wanted to stay where they were. So in the cases of hidden children in France and in Poland, you very often, again, it sort of makes sense. These are the only families that these children knew, had children who really violently resisted returning to parents and to countries that were supposedly home, but that they had no memory of. During the Cold War, a similar kind of dynamic erupts, but there you start to see children both kind of wanting to stay where they are and with the people that they consider their families or their peer groups, but also starting to make, I think, independent political calculations in some cases. So there were a lot of cases beginning in 1948 and going on into the 50s of teenagers in particular who refused to return to Eastern Europe at the same time that the governments of those countries were reclaiming them. And there were custody courts set up in the US zone where these cases were heard and the children often testified. And one of the issues that arose that I found particularly interesting was a kind of debate about how to even define a child in this context, because in a sense it was a very legalistic question. At what age does a child have the right to decide their own fate? But I think, and people disagreed about that depending on what their political position was. But at the same time, it became a sort of more philosophical debate because there was this widespread consensus that, that World War II had destroyed childhood itself, and therefore that, a 13 or 14-year-old was mature beyond his or her years and deserved the right to have a say in where they ended up going. And they very often did. I mean, I think not always. In some cases, they, especially younger children had really no say. But teenagers often did have some kind of voice in determining where they ended up. Yes?
Yeah, you keep talking about the children who wanted to stay with the people who hid them. I suspect that's partly a function of what country they were in.
Mm-hmm.
Probably children, I happen to be a child survivor, children who were hidden in Holland, Belgium, places like that, would be much more willing to stay where they were than by Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly also by countries to the east where anti-Semitism was much more rife. Secondly, it had to do with age,
Mm-hmm.
because kids who were too young to remember their parents, and I'm talking about Jewish kids now,
Mm-hmm.
who remember their parents, remember their religion, remember their real name, and so on. The ones who remembered it were much less likely to want to stay afterwards with the people that had hidden them.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who couldn't remember, that they couldn't remember, so they were willing to stay with the only people they did know. Many of the people that I know who were hidden children stayed very close and affectionate with the family that hid them, but were perfectly willing to go back to their own parents if their parents survived, or other relatives if they survived. I can tell you from people that I've done research with, as well as my own experience, many children who were old enough loathed the Germans,
Mm-hmm.
hated the Germans, who had persecuted them, murdered their families, etc. And they weren't all that eager to return to their homelands, which had, in many cases, collaborated with the Germans in doing those things. And so for them to want to go to Palestine or to Australia or wherever, it wasn't an issue of the country wanting them because they would be assimilable and all that. They wanted to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think those are all really good points. I definitely have seen in the sources what you're saying about the differences between Eastern and Western Europe. I mean, I've mostly looked at Poland, but there it seems like you certainly don't have as many cases of children wanting to stay with their foster parents. There, the conflicts more often emerged between sometimes between children and their surviving parents, where the kids wanted to go to Palestine and the parents wanted to stay. And so, I mean, with older kids, with teenagers. So you have letters from parents whose kids have kind of run away with kibbutzim and things like that. But of course, in the sources, I'm often seeing the cases of conflict. So the stories where there's less conflict don't show up as much. I think you're absolutely right that obviously age would have been a huge factor in determining how a child reacted to being reclaimed. And there are many stories of kids who initially resisted going back to their families, but then eventually settled in and were reunited. So.
One of the hidden children in France ended up as the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris. You know that story.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Now, I'd like to say one more thing. Your terminology is very revealing, because people from Eastern Europe, whether they're Jews or not, frequently talk about Ukrainians and Poles and Russians and Jews and so on and so forth. People from Central and Western Europe tend to talk about Christian and Jewish, Austrians, Germans, Hungarians, and so on. It's not Jews and the nationality. It's the nationality that encompasses and the distinctions by religion.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you talked about them was the Eastern European.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I think there's a question here.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really great. I'm starting my master's thesis that will be about Americanization programs for displaced persons who came to New York City. So I'm interested in what what renationalization looked like who ran the programs, what were the programs like, and how did countries respond to the responsibility of having these children who they were then going to renationalize? Can you talk about those programs?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in some ways it was very kind of almost what you would imagine, that they would bring in teams of teachers from the native country, textbooks, so on and so forth, and actually kind of try to teach the children the language, sing songs, play games. There was a lot of, one of the things that's really fascinating about this moment is that these camps and homes became kind of laboratories. It's not something I talked about as much in this talk, but all these orphanages and homes and camps became kind of laboratories for developing new ideas of child development and child psychology in general. So there were a lot of really creative people, social workers and psychologists and educators, who were kind of trying out new forms of progressive pedagogy. The Trogan International Children's Village is actually a really good example of that. So they had some very utopian and idealistic methods. Now, I think, you know, the American story would be very different, because you've started your research, I'm sure, but I've seen a lot of kind of pamphlets and things aimed at new Americans that are incredibly didactic about kind of how, you know, the American family is different from the European family, and you know, all these kinds of things that are really fascinating. So it's a great topic. Yes?
I have two questions. One is about language. If when social workers had to make the decision whether to send these children back to their, let's say, homeland or their families, was language a barrier? If the child could no longer speak his homeland language, maybe they would rather leave the child in his foster family. The other question regards young women. Did you see anything about a preference for accepting young women as well?
As refugee, in what, like after the war or before the war?
After the war, you were talking about deporting refugees. Were they in any way perceived as a prize group?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so the first question was about, could you remind me of language? I've never seen a case where an East European government admitted that language might be a barrier. I think they were basically pretty confident that, you know, it will come back. I mean, that was certainly an argument made on the other side, but the East European governments were pretty adamant about getting their kids back almost no matter what. The preference for women, that's a really interesting question. There were a lot of preferential programs for domestic servants. That was one of the primary ways, both before and after the war, that female refugees were placed. So they were seen as a very desirable category of workers in that sense. Countries that were looking to increase their population generally wanted families. So the number of children that a couple had and would be considered an advantage, as would be bringing in married couples rather than single men, say. Other than that, I haven't. I mean, this is a kind of different question, but I think you're sort of going more toward like women as childbearing. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any kind of explicit discussion of that, but there was certainly a huge preference for little girls in like the kinder transports and any other kind of child refugee program before the war. Basically, everybody wanted 3-year-old girls, and it was extremely hard to place boys, except for people who wanted older boys as farm laborers, which the humanitarian organizations were, you know, kind of attuned to, but it was a problem to place boys. One of the things that happens in terms of gender after the war that is really interesting is that there's a lot of concern among these humanitarian workers and social workers and psychologists that refugee girls had lost their capacity to be good mothers. So there's a huge discourse around refugee women. Atina Grossman has written about this in the case of Jewish refugee women. But there's a huge discussion of refugee girls and women and how they've they've become defeminized through their experiences in the camps. They've become selfish. They no longer have the capacity to be mothers. And so they instituted a lot of homemaking courses and in refugee camps, and kind of one of the ways they tried to rehabilitate women and girls was by teaching them mothering and homemaking skills. So that was explicitly discussed. Yes?
I do want to thank you for really a very illuminating and informative talk that, as far as I'm concerned, as a historian of Europe, put all sorts of pieces together for me. When I was living in Germany for a year in 1970, one saw quite frequently signs, I think, put up by the German Red Cross, pictures of people in their, young men and women in their mid-20s, that basically say something like, I was separated from my parents someplace in Silesia at the age of 1.5 and taken to an orphanage. I don't know who I am. Or, you know, I know I was born in a railway station in Brandenburg in April 1945 and immediately taken to some orphanage. Who am I? Can you give me my identity back? This was really still an issue in 25 years after the war ended. What I'm wondering about is how significant were the number of these cases in the kind of situations that you've been dealing with? Were these just anomalies, or was there a really large number of people of that generation in Germany and Eastern Europe around whom the issue of repatriation was complicated by the fact that actually nobody knew who they were?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I've seen those posters. I've seen more of the posters right after the war, where it's pictures of babies. The numbers issue is a pretty difficult one to answer. I can say that I know, just sort of pulling this out of my memory, that I think in 1949 there was something like 350,000 missing children registered with the German Red Cross in that year. And there were discussions of like, why did it take people 4 years to register the fact that their child was missing? But I think it's pretty clear that the numbers were in the hundreds of thousands at least. And that would only have been German children, because the one thing, I didn't specify this, but the United Nations was really only dealing with children of what they called allied nations. German missing children, of which there were hundreds of thousands, were the responsibility of German authorities. There's a wonderful novel that was recently written about this issue of the German children lost during the expulsions, called Lost by Hans Ulrich Treichel, and it's precisely about this issue. But it was a huge issue there, and it became a real Cold War issue, because then the question became, what about families that were separated across the Iron Curtain? And programs of family reunification continued into the 60s and 70s, I'm pretty sure, if not longer. So, yes?
You mentioned, or at least I had such an impression, that the nationalist discourse was the primary force behind humanitarian effort to solve the problem of lost children. But I can hardly believe that the 19th century and early 20th century nationalist ideas were the only donor of ideas to the humanitarian effort. Wasn't it influenced by the ideas of enlighteners or by discourses of Christianity, and particularly of Catholicism, which is in a way very anti-nationalist? What about socialist ideas? I know that Sweden was important in the post-war humanitarian effort, and Sweden had been governed by social democrats actually at that time. And what about such an agent as the Soviet government, which actually had experience of dealing with the problem of lost children already before the war? I mean, children of Spanish communists who died during the Spanish Civil War. So what about these agents and discourses, how they were involved in the...
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think you're absolutely right that nationalist impulses were certainly not the only thing that ever drove any humanitarian mission, and all of the other motivations that you mention, religious, Enlightenment ideas, socialist ideas, all of those drove various kinds of humanitarian organizations and over the course of the 20th century. I think what I'm sort of trying to talk about here is how in this particular moment after the Second World War, one of the things that's interesting is that if you look at all of these different kinds of organizations that you mentioned, that you could look at what the Quakers were doing, what Catholic organizations were doing, what the Soviet government was doing, that all had really, in a sense, extremely divergent ideological origins and motivations. That in all of these organizations, even if it wasn't their primary, even if their reason for existence, they certainly wouldn't have said our primary mission is to create homogenous nation states, that they all somehow became complicit in this project of nationalization and managed in very different ways often to kind of square the circle between, for example, an idea of an Enlightenment idea of humanitarianism or a Christian idea of humanitarianism and the notion that children belong in some sense to national communities. And that's sort of what I found really striking. But it doesn't mean that all of those other forms of humanitarian, all those other motivations weren't very powerful forces behind humanitarianism at its origins, and even in this period as well. So I think that's an excellent point.
I think there's time for more discussion at the reception. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions.